The Great Depression was a crucible that forged modern society, its impact still resonating today. As the global economy teetered on collapse, the very foundations of capitalism were tested and transformed. In the aftermath of World War I, the global economy was a complex tapestry woven from threads of industrialization, technological innovation, and shifting geopolitical alliances. The Roaring Twenties, as they would come to be known, were marked by unprecedented prosperity in the United States, with mass production, consumerism, and speculation fueling an era of unbridled growth. Cities like New York and Chicago became hubs of economic activity, their skyscrapers piercing the sky like giant steel spires, symbols of a nation's unyielding ambition. As the world struggled to rebuild from the devastation of war, the United States emerged as a dominant economic power, its industries producing goods at an unprecedented scale. The introduction of the assembly line by Henry Ford in 1913 had revolutionized manufacturing, making cars, radios, and other consumer goods more affordable and accessible to the average American. The resulting surge in consumer spending created a self-reinforcing cycle of growth, with businesses expanding production to meet soaring demand. However, beneath the surface of this prosperity, warning signs began to emerge. The widespread adoption of margin buying, which allowed investors to purchase stocks with borrowed money, created a culture of speculation and recklessness on Wall Street. As stock prices soared, many Americans, including those of modest means, were drawn into the market, hoping to make a quick profit. The notion that stocks were a surefire path to wealth became a pervasive myth, fueling a speculative bubble that would eventually burst with devastating consequences. In rural America, a different story was unfolding. The agricultural sector, which had experienced a brief boom during World War I due to increased demand for food and other commodities, began to decline in the 1920s. Overproduction, coupled with a decline in global demand, led to plummeting crop prices, leaving many farmers struggling to make ends meet. The introduction of tractors and other mechanized farming equipment, while increasing efficiency, also displaced thousands of farm workers who migrated to urban areas in search of employment. As the decade wore on, the disconnect between the booming industrial economy and the struggling agricultural sector grew more pronounced. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised tariffs on imported goods to record levels, was intended to protect American industries but ultimately exacerbated the decline in global trade, further destabilizing the economy. The seeds of disaster were being sown as the very foundations of the global economic system began to show signs of strain. In the summer of 1929, a sense of unease began to creep over the financial markets. Stock prices, which had risen to dizzying heights, started to falter, and the first whispers of a potential downturn began to circulate among investors and economists. The warnings were largely ignored, however, as the prevailing mood remained one of optimism and complacency. The notion that the economy was somehow immune to the forces of gravity, that the good times would never end, had taken hold, blinding many to the gathering storm clouds on the horizon. As the summer of 1929 wore on, the tremors in the financial markets grew more pronounced. On September 3, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average reached its peak at 3081.17, a milestone that would mark the beginning of the end of the speculative bubble. The warning signs were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, with stock prices fluctuating wildly and investors growing anxious about the sustainability of the market's lofty valuations. One of the most prominent voices cautioning against the dangers of speculation was that of Roger Babson, a respected economist and founder of the Babson Institute. In a speech delivered on September 5, 1929, at the annual convention of the National Association of Real Estate Boards in Chicago, Babson warned that sooner or later a crash is coming and it may be terrific. His words were met with skepticism by many who saw him as a Cassandra figure, always predicting doom but never quite getting it right. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., President Herbert Hoover was growing increasingly concerned about the state of the economy. On September 10, 1929, he summoned a group of prominent businessmen and economists to the White House for an emergency meeting to discuss the deteriorating economic situation. The gathering included figures such as Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Ford, who had revolutionized manufacturing with his assembly line production methods. Despite these efforts to address the growing crisis, the stock market continued its downward spiral. On October 24, 1929, known as Black Thursday, panic selling swept through the exchanges, with stocks plummeting in value and investors scrambling to limit their losses. The New York Stock Exchange was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sell orders, and trading was temporarily halted on several occasions to allow for the processing of transactions. The chaos on Wall Street was mirrored by scenes of desperation across the country. In cities like Detroit and Cleveland, thousands of workers who had invested their life savings in the stock market found themselves suddenly and utterly destitute. The once thriving neighborhoods surrounding the factories and industrial plants were now filled with the sounds of shattering glass and the smell of smoke, as families who could no longer afford to pay their mortgages were forced out onto the streets. As the days turned into weeks, the full extent of the disaster became increasingly clear. Banks, which had invested heavily in the stock market, began to fail, taking the savings of millions of Americans with them. The collapse of the banking system had a devastating ripple effect on the entire economy, as credit dried up and businesses were unable to secure the financing they needed to stay afloat. As the banking system continued to collapse, the effects on the broader economy were catastrophic. By the end of 1929, over 600 banks had failed, taking with them the life savings of millions of Americans. The once thriving main streets of small towns and cities were now lined with shuttered storefronts, as businesses struggled to stay afloat without access to credit. In Detroit, the automotive capital of the world, car sales plummeted by over 75% in just a few months, leaving hundreds of thousands of workers without jobs. In the agricultural heartland, farmers who had taken on debt to expand their operations during the booming 1920s were now facing foreclosure as crop prices plummeted and banks called in their loans. The situation was particularly dire for African American farmers in the South, who faced discriminatory lending practices and were often forced to accept lower prices for their crops. In the Mississippi Delta region, for example, cotton prices fell from 40 cents per pound in 1929 to just 6 cents per pound by 1931, leaving many black farmers on the brink of destitution. As the economic crisis deepened, the social fabric of American society began to fray. Shantytowns, known as Hoovervilles, sprang up in cities across the country as families who had lost their homes to foreclosure or eviction were forced to live in squalid conditions. In Seattle, a particularly large and well-organized Hooverville was established on the outskirts of the city, with its own system of government, social services, and even a newspaper. The residents of this makeshift community, many of whom were former middle-class Americans, struggled to maintain a sense of dignity and purpose in the face of overwhelming hardship. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., President Hoover was facing mounting criticism for his handling of the crisis. Despite his efforts to reassure the public that the economy was fundamentally sound, it was becoming increasingly clear that more drastic action was needed. In December 1929, Hoover established the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief, a committee tasked with coordinating federal and state efforts to address the growing crisis. However, the committee's efforts were hampered by the administration's refusal to provide direct financial assistance to those in need, preferring instead to rely on voluntary charitable efforts. As the winter of 1929-30 wore on, the humanitarian situation continued to deteriorate. In New York City, soup kitchens and bread lines became a common sight, as thousands of people waited in line for hours just to receive a meager meal. The city's charities were overwhelmed by the demand, and many were forced to turn people away due to lack of resources. In Chicago, the situation was even more dire, with reports of families burning furniture and other flammable materials just to stay warm during the bitter cold winter months. In this context of growing desperation, a new generation of leaders began to emerge, advocating for more radical solutions to the crisis. In Congress, representatives like Fiorello LaGuardia of New York and Robert La Follette Jr. of Wisconsin were pushing for increased government spending on public works projects and direct relief programs. Outside of Washington, Figures like Huey Long, the charismatic governor of Louisiana, were gaining popularity with their promises to share the wealth and provide a more equitable distribution of resources to those in need. As the winter of 1929-30 wore on, the humanitarian situation continued to deteriorate, and the calls for more radical solutions grew louder. In February 1930, a group of prominent economists, including Irving Fisher and Paul Douglas, wrote an open letter to President Hoover, urging him to increase government spending and provide direct relief to those affected by the crisis. The letter, which was published in major newspapers across the country, marked a significant turning point in the debate over how to address the Depression. Meanwhile, in Congress, representatives like Fiorello LaGuardia and Robert La Follette Jr. were pushing for legislation that would provide more direct assistance to those in need. In March 1930, LaGuardia introduced a bill that would have provided $150 million in federal funds for public works projects, but it was ultimately defeated by conservative opponents who argued that it would lead to inflation and undermine the economy. Despite these setbacks, the momentum for more radical action continued to build. In April 1930, a group of unemployed workers in Detroit, led by a young organizer named Carl Johnson, staged a massive protest march through the city's streets, demanding jobs and relief from the government. The march, which drew thousands of participants, was a powerful symbol of the growing desperation and frustration among Americans who had been affected by the Depression. As the spring of 1930 wore on, the economic situation continued to deteriorate. In May, the stock market suffered another severe decline, wiping out millions of dollars in investments and further eroding confidence in the economy. The collapse of the banking system also continued, with over 1,000 banks failing between January and June 1930 alone. In response to these developments, President Hoover announced a series of measures aimed at stimulating the economy, including a $100 million program to support farm prices and a $150 million program to fund public works projects. However, these efforts were widely seen as too little, too late, and many critics argued that they did not go far enough to address the scale of the crisis. One of the most vocal critics of Hoover's policies was Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana. Long had risen to prominence in the 1920s as a champion of the common man, and he had built a massive following among poor and working-class Americans who saw him as a champion of their interests. In the spring of 1930, Long launched a national speaking tour, during which he excoriated Hoover and the Republican Party for their handling of the Depression. Long's speeches were electrifying, and they drew huge crowds wherever he went. He called for a radical redistribution of wealth, arguing that the rich had too much power and influence in American society. He also advocated for a series of sweeping reforms, including a 100% tax on all incomes over $1 million and a program to provide every American with a guaranteed minimum income. As Long's popularity grew, so did his influence. In June 1930, he announced that he would be running for the U.S. Senate, and his campaign quickly gained momentum. Long's candidacy was seen as a major challenge to the established order, and it sparked a fierce backlash from conservative opponents who saw him as a threat to their power and privilege. The battle between Long and his opponents would be a defining feature of American politics in the early 1930s, and it would have far-reaching consequences for the country. In July 1930, the Democratic National Convention met in Chicago, where delegates gathered to nominate a candidate for president. The convention was marked by fierce infighting between different factions of the party, but ultimately, the Democrats nominated Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York, as their candidate. Roosevelt's nomination was seen as a major breakthrough for the forces of reform, and it sparked widespread excitement among Americans who were looking for a new direction. However, the Republicans were not about to give up without a fight, and they nominated President Hoover for re-election, arguing that he had done everything in his power to address the crisis. As the summer of 1930 wore on, Roosevelt's campaign gained momentum, with the Democratic candidate crisscrossing the country to deliver speeches and meet with voters. One of his key advisors, Louis Howe, played a crucial role in shaping Roosevelt's message and strategy, helping him to craft a platform that would appeal to the millions of Americans who had been affected by the Depression. In August, Roosevelt embarked on a whistle-stop tour of the West Coast, where he delivered a series of speeches that emphasized his commitment to relief for farmers and workers. Meanwhile, President Hoover was facing growing criticism from within his own party, as some Republicans began to question his handling of the crisis. In September, a group of conservative senators, led by Reed Smoot of Utah, introduced a bill that would have provided $30 million in aid to drought-stricken farmers, but Hoover vetoed it, arguing that it was too expensive and would lead to inflation. The move sparked outrage among farmers and rural communities, who felt that the president was not doing enough to help them. As the election season heated up, Huey Long continued to make waves with his radical proposals and charismatic speeches. In October, he delivered a speech in New Orleans in which he called for a Share Our Wealth program, under which the government would confiscate all incomes over $1 million and redistribute them to the poor. The speech was met with thunderous applause from the crowd, and it helped to cement Long's reputation as one of the most outspoken and effective critics of the establishment. In November, Americans went to the polls to vote in the midterm elections, which would determine control of Congress for the next 2 years. The results were a disaster for the Republicans, who lost 52 seats in the House of Representatives and 8 seats in the Senate. The Democrats, on the other hand, made significant gains, and they emerged from the election with a clear majority in both chambers. In December, a group of Democratic senators, led by Robert Wagner of New York, introduced a bill that would have provided $1.5 billion in relief to states and localities, but Hoover threatened to veto it, arguing that it was too expensive and would lead to inflation. As the year drew to a close, the economic situation continued to deteriorate, with unemployment soaring to over 16% and industrial production plummeting to its lowest levels since the Depression began. In response, a group of economists and policymakers, led by Mariner Eccles, began to develop a new approach to monetary policy that would emphasize government intervention and fiscal stimulus. The idea was still in its infancy, but it would eventually become a key component of the New Deal, the series of policies and programs that would be implemented by Franklin Roosevelt after his inauguration in 1933. In January 1931, the banking crisis deepened as a wave of bank failures swept across the Midwest, wiping out millions of dollars in deposits and leaving thousands of people without access to their savings. The crisis was particularly severe in Chicago, where several major banks failed, including the Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company. In response, the Federal Reserve Board, led by Chairman Roy Young, began to take emergency measures to stabilize the banking system, including injecting liquidity into the economy and providing loans to struggling banks. As the banking crisis deepened, the Federal Reserve Board's efforts to stabilize the system were hindered by the gold standard, which limited the government's ability to print more money and increase liquidity. In February 1931, the Fed raised interest rates to 4.5%, in an attempt to attract foreign investors and stem the outflow of gold from the United States. However, this move only exacerbated the economic downturn, as higher interest rates made it even more difficult for businesses and individuals to borrow money. Meanwhile, President Hoover's administration was facing growing criticism for its handling of the crisis. In March 1931, a group of prominent economists, including Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes, wrote an open letter to the president urging him to adopt more expansionary fiscal policies to stimulate economic recovery. However, Hoover remained committed to his balanced budget approach, believing that government spending should be limited to essential services and that the economy would eventually recover on its own. As the year wore on, the economic situation continued to deteriorate. Unemployment soared to over 20%, with some states experiencing rates as high as 40%. Industrial production plummeted, and agricultural prices fell to record lows. In response, a growing number of Americans began to call for more radical solutions to the crisis. In April 1931, a group of veterans marched on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of a promised bonus for their service in World War I. The Bonus Army, as it came to be known, was eventually dispersed by the U.S. Army, but not before it had drawn national attention to the plight of struggling Americans. In May 1931, the Austrian bank Creditanstalt failed, triggering a wave of bank failures across Europe. The collapse of the European banking system put additional pressure on the already strained American financial system, leading to a sharp decline in international trade and a further contraction in economic activity. As the summer of 1931 drew to a close, it was clear that the Great Depression was far from over and that more drastic measures would be needed to address the crisis. In June 1931, President Hoover appointed a committee to study the causes of the Depression and recommend solutions. The committee, which included prominent economists and business leaders, issued a report in October 1931 calling for increased government spending on infrastructure projects, as well as the creation of a federal agency to provide relief to struggling farmers. However, the report's recommendations were largely ignored by the Hoover administration, which continued to prioritize balanced budgets over economic stimulus. As the election season approached, the Democratic Party began to coalesce around a platform that emphasized government intervention in the economy and increased spending on relief programs. In August 1931, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York, delivered a speech in which he called for a more active role for government in addressing the economic crisis. Roosevelt's speech was seen as a major departure from the traditional Democratic Party approach to economics, and it helped to establish him as a leading contender for the party's presidential nomination in 1932. In the fall of 1931, a series of droughts and floods struck the American heartland, further exacerbating the economic crisis. The agricultural sector, which had already been hit hard by declining prices and reduced demand, was particularly affected. In response, the Hoover administration established a number of programs to provide relief to struggling farmers, including the Federal Farm Board, which offered loans and price supports to farmers. However, these efforts were largely insufficient to address the scale of the crisis, and many farmers were forced to abandon their land or default on their mortgages. As the winter of 1931 to 1932 set in, the economic crisis deepened, with unemployment rates soaring to over 25% in some states. The city's mayor, Jimmy Walker, established a number of emergency relief programs, including a municipal loan program to help struggling homeowners avoid foreclosure. In Washington, D.C., President Hoover continued to resist calls for more radical action to address the crisis. However, as the months dragged on and the economic situation continued to deteriorate, it became increasingly clear that Hoover's approach was not working. In January 1932, a group of prominent economists, including Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes, met with President Hoover to urge him to adopt more expansionary fiscal policies to stimulate economic recovery. They argued that the government should increase spending on infrastructure projects such as roads and bridges and provide direct relief to struggling families. However, Hoover remained skeptical, and the meeting ended without any agreement on a new course of action. In February 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York, announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination, running on a platform that included a call for a more active role for government in addressing the economic crisis. Roosevelt's campaign gained momentum in the spring of 1932 as he traveled the country delivering speeches and meeting with voters. He promised to provide direct relief to struggling families, to increase spending on infrastructure projects, and to reform the banking system to prevent future crises. His message resonated with many Americans who were desperate for a change from the failed policies of the Hoover administration. In March 1932, the Republican Party held its national convention in Chicago, where President Hoover was renominated for president. However, the convention was marked by divisions within the party, with some delegates calling for more radical action to address the economic crisis. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, held its convention in June 1932, where Roosevelt was nominated for president on the fourth ballot. As the summer of 1932 wore on, the economic crisis continued to deepen, with unemployment rates soaring and businesses failing at an alarming rate. The presidential election campaign became increasingly focused on the economy, with Roosevelt promising to provide a new deal for Americans and Hoover arguing that his policies would eventually lead to recovery. In July 1932, a group of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of a promised bonus for their service. The marchers, who numbered in the tens of thousands, set up a sprawling encampment on the outskirts of the city, where they lived in squalid conditions and struggled to survive. The Hoover administration responded to the crisis by deploying the U.S. Army to disperse the marchers, leading to violent clashes and widespread criticism of the government's handling of the situation. As the bonus army marched on Washington, Roosevelt was campaigning in the West, where he delivered a series of speeches calling for a more active role for government in addressing the economic crisis. As the bonus army's march on Washington drew national attention, Roosevelt's campaign continued to gain momentum, with his message of hope and change resonating deeply with Americans struggling to make ends meet. In August 1932, he embarked on a whistle-stop tour of the country, delivering speeches and meeting with voters in small towns and cities across the nation. At each stop, he reiterated his commitment to providing direct relief to struggling families, increasing spending on infrastructure projects, and reforming the banking system to prevent future crises. One of the key stops on Roosevelt's tour was the town of Topeka, Kansas, where he addressed a crowd of thousands at the state fairgrounds. In his speech, he emphasized the need for government intervention in the economy, arguing that the free market had failed to provide for the basic needs of many Americans. He also highlighted the importance of agriculture to the national economy, promising to support farmers through subsidies and other forms of assistance. The crowd responded enthusiastically to Roosevelt's message, with many in attendance expressing their gratitude for his willingness to listen to their concerns and offer solutions to the economic crisis. As Roosevelt's campaign gained steam, President Hoover found himself increasingly on the defensive, struggling to respond effectively to the challengers' criticisms of his administration's handling of the economy. In a series of speeches and statements, Hoover argued that his policies were beginning to show signs of success, citing modest improvements in industrial production and employment rates. However, these claims were largely met with skepticism by voters who saw little evidence of improvement in their own lives. Meanwhile, the bonus army's encampment on the outskirts of Washington continued to grow, with thousands of veterans and their families living in squalid conditions as they awaited a response from the government to their demands. The situation was becoming increasingly volatile, with tensions between the marchers and local authorities escalating by the day. On August 28, 1932, a group of veterans marched on the Capitol building where they were met by police who attempted to disperse them using tear gas and batons. The clash ended in chaos, with several veterans injured and dozens arrested. The incident sparked widespread outrage across the country, with many Americans expressing shock and disgust at the government's handling of the situation. Roosevelt was quick to condemn the violence, issuing a statement that criticized the Hoover administration for its heavy-handed response to the marchers' demands. He also reiterated his commitment to providing support to veterans, promising to make their needs a top priority if he were elected president. As the fall campaign season heated up, the economy continued to deteriorate, with unemployment rates soaring and businesses failing at an alarming rate. The situation was particularly dire in industrial centers like Detroit and Chicago, where thousands of workers had been laid off from jobs in the automotive and manufacturing sectors. In these cities, Roosevelt's message of hope and change found a receptive audience, with many voters expressing their desire for a new direction in Washington. In October 1932, Roosevelt embarked on a tour of the industrial Midwest, where he delivered speeches and met with workers in cities like Cleveland and Milwaukee. At each stop, he emphasized his commitment to supporting American industry, promising to provide government subsidies and other forms of assistance to help businesses get back on their feet. He also highlighted the need for greater regulation of the financial sector, arguing that the reckless speculation and profiteering of the 1920s had contributed to the economic crisis. As Roosevelt's tour of the industrial Midwest continued, he stopped in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he addressed a crowd of thousands at the city's Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall. In his speech, he emphasized the need for government investment in infrastructure projects, citing the example of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which had been established earlier that year to provide flood control, electrification, and economic development to the Tennessee River Valley. He argued that similar projects could be undertaken in other regions, providing much-needed jobs and stimulating economic growth. The crowd in Pittsburgh responded enthusiastically to Roosevelt's message, with many in attendance expressing their support for his plans to revitalize American industry. One of the attendees was a young steelworker named Joe Kane, who had been laid off from his job at the local mill just a few weeks earlier. Kane was deeply impressed by Roosevelt's commitment to supporting American workers and his willingness to challenge the powerful interests that had dominated the economy for so long. As the campaign season drew to a close, Roosevelt's message of hope and change continued to resonate with voters across the country. In the final days of the campaign, he embarked on a whirlwind tour of the Northeast, stopping in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. At each stop, he reiterated his commitment to providing relief to those affected by the Depression, reforming the financial system, and promoting economic recovery through government investment and job creation. Meanwhile, President Hoover was struggling to respond effectively to Roosevelt's criticisms of his administration's handling of the economy. On November 8, 1932, Americans went to the polls to cast their ballots in the presidential election. The results were decisive, with Roosevelt winning 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. The Democratic Party also made significant gains in Congress, gaining control of both the House and Senate. As the news of Roosevelt's victory spread, crowds gathered in cities across the country to celebrate the dawn of a new era in American politics. In the weeks following the election, Roosevelt began to assemble his team of advisors and cabinet members, drawing on a diverse range of experts and officials from across the country. One of his key appointments was Francis Perkins, a veteran social worker and labor activist who would serve as Secretary of Labor. Perkins was a pioneering figure in the field of social welfare, having worked tirelessly to promote workers' rights and improve working conditions in factories and mills across the country. As Roosevelt's inauguration approached, the country was filled with a sense of anticipation and expectation. Many Americans saw the new president as a beacon of hope in a time of great crisis, and they looked to him to provide leadership and direction in the face of unprecedented challenges. On March 4, 1933, Roosevelt took the oath of office on the steps of the Capitol building, surrounded by crowds of cheering supporters. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency were marked by a flurry of activity, as the new administration moved swiftly to implement its agenda of reform and recovery. One of the key pieces of legislation passed during this period was the Emergency Banking Act, which provided emergency loans to struggling banks and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to insure bank deposits. The act helped to stabilize the banking system and restore confidence in the financial sector, paving the way for a gradual recovery in economic activity. As the spring of 1933 wore on, Roosevelt's administration continued to push forward with its ambitious program of reform and recovery. The president's advisors and cabinet members worked tirelessly to develop new policies and programs, drawing on the expertise of scholars, businessmen, and labor leaders from across the country. One of the key areas of focus was agriculture, where the devastating impact of the Depression had left millions of farmers struggling to make ends meet. To address this crisis, Roosevelt's administration established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which is known as the AAA, which provided subsidies to farmers who agreed to reduce crop production and raise prices. The AAA was just one part of a broader effort to promote economic recovery and reform in rural America. Another key initiative was the Soil Conservation Service, which worked with farmers to develop new techniques for conserving soil and preventing erosion. The service was established in response to the devastating Dust Bowl, which had affected millions of acres of farmland across the Great Plains. By providing technical assistance and financial support to farmers, the Soil Conservation Service helped to promote more sustainable agricultural practices and reduce the risk of future disasters. As the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, began to take shape, Roosevelt's administration faced significant challenges in implementing its programs. One of the key figures behind the AAA was Secretary of Agriculture Henry A. Wallace, who had been a strong advocate for agricultural reform. Wallace worked closely with Roosevelt to develop the AAA, which aimed to raise farm prices by reducing crop production and paying farmers to take land out of production. The program was controversial, with some critics arguing that it would lead to food shortages and others claiming that it would unfairly benefit large farmers at the expense of smaller ones. Despite these challenges, the AAA began to show promising results. Farm prices started to rise, and many farmers who had been struggling to make ends meet began to see a glimmer of hope. The AAA also helped to promote more sustainable agricultural practices, such as crop rotation and soil conservation, which would have long-term benefits for the environment and farm productivity. However, the program was not without its flaws, and it faced significant opposition from farmers who felt that they were being forced to reduce production or take land out of use. In addition to the AAA, Roosevelt's administration also established the Civilian Conservation Corps, a program aimed at providing jobs for young men in conservation and infrastructure projects. The CCC was a massive undertaking, with over 250,000 men enrolled in the program at its peak. These young men worked on a wide range of projects, from building roads and bridges to planting trees and fighting forest fires. The CCC not only provided much-needed employment, but also helped to promote conservation and environmental protection. To address this crisis, Roosevelt's administration established the National Industrial Recovery Act, which provided for codes of fair competition and set minimum wages and working conditions for industries. The NIRA was a significant departure from previous government policies, which had largely favored business interests over those of labor. The act established the National Recovery Administration, which was responsible for developing and enforcing the codes of fair competition. The NRA was led by Hugh S. Johnson, a charismatic and outspoken figure who became a prominent advocate for the New Deal. Johnson traveled the country, promoting the NRA and encouraging businesses to adopt the codes of fair competition. As the summer of 1933 approached, the NIRA began to show promising results. Industries that had been struggling to stay afloat began to see a glimmer of hope, and many workers who had been struggling to make ends meet started to see an improvement in their wages and working conditions. However, the NIRA was not without its challenges, and it faced significant opposition from businesses that felt that the codes of fair competition were too restrictive or burdensome. Despite these challenges, Roosevelt's administration continued to push forward with its agenda of reform and recovery. One of the key areas of focus was housing, where the devastating impact of the Depression had left millions of families struggling to find affordable and decent places to live. To address this crisis, Roosevelt's administration established the Federal Housing Administration, which is FHA, which provided mortgage insurance and other forms of support for homebuyers. The FHA was a significant departure from previous government policies, which had largely ignored the housing needs of low and moderate-income families. The agency was led by James A. Moffett, a veteran housing expert who had worked tirelessly to promote affordable housing. Moffett traveled the country, promoting the FHA and encouraging lenders to provide mortgages to families who might not have otherwise qualified. As the summer of 1933 wore on, the FHA began to show promising results. Families that had been struggling to find decent and affordable housing started to see a glimmer of hope, and many communities began to experience a resurgence in construction and economic activity. However, the FHA was not without its challenges, and it faced significant opposition from lenders who felt that the agency's mortgage insurance programs were too risky or burdensome. One of the key areas of focus was the arts, where the devastating impact of the Depression had left many artists and writers struggling to make ends meet. To address this crisis, Roosevelt's administration established the Federal Theater Project, which provided funding for theatrical productions and other forms of artistic expression. The FTP was a significant departure from previous government policies, which had largely ignored the arts as a vital part of American culture. The project was led by Hallie Flanagan, a veteran theater producer who had worked tirelessly to promote the arts. Flanagan traveled the country, promoting the FTP and encouraging artists and writers to apply for funding. Artists and writers who had been struggling to make ends meet started to see a glimmer of hope, and many communities began to experience a resurgence in cultural activity. However, the FTP was not without its challenges, and it faced significant opposition from critics who felt that the project was too expensive or frivolous. As the summer of 1933 wore on, the Federal Theater Project continued to gain momentum, with productions springing up in cities across the country. In New York City, the FTP's Negro unit produced a critically acclaimed production of The Emperor Jones, starring Charles Gilpin as the titular character. The production was hailed as a groundbreaking achievement not only for its artistic merit, but also for its bold portrayal of African American life and experience. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the FTP's director, Hallie Flanagan, was working tirelessly to promote the project and secure funding for its continued operation. Flanagan was a passionate advocate for the arts, and she saw the FTP as a vital part of the New Deal's efforts to revitalize American culture and provide relief to those affected by the Depression. She traveled extensively, meeting with artists, writers, and community leaders to discuss the project and encourage participation. One of the most notable aspects of the FTP was its emphasis on community engagement and participation. The project encouraged local communities to become involved in the production process, whether through acting, writing, or designing sets and costumes. This approach not only helped to foster a sense of ownership and pride among community members, but also provided valuable training and experience for aspiring artists. In Chicago, for example, the FTP's production of The Revolt of the Beavers brought together a diverse group of community members, including actors, musicians, and puppeteers. The production was staged in a vacant lot on the city's south side, with sets and costumes designed by local artists. As the FTP continued to grow and evolve, it faced numerous challenges, including funding shortages, logistical difficulties, and criticism from conservative groups who saw the project as a waste of taxpayer dollars. Despite these obstacles, however, the FTP remained a vibrant and dynamic force in American cultural life, providing a platform for artistic expression and community engagement during a time of great need. In addition to its work in theater, the FTP also supported a range of other artistic initiatives, including music, dance, and visual arts programs. The project's music unit, for example, produced a series of concerts and recordings featuring American folk music, while its dance unit developed innovative new works that explored the intersection of movement and social commentary. The FTP's visual arts unit, meanwhile, supported a range of projects, from mural painting to sculpture, that reflected the experiences and concerns of ordinary Americans during the Depression. One notable example was the work of artist Thomas Hart Benton, who created a series of murals for the FTP that depicted scenes of everyday life in America, from farming and industry to urban poverty and social unrest. Through its support for artists like Benton, the FTP helped to promote a new kind of American art, one that was rooted in the experiences and traditions of ordinary people rather than the elite. This approach not only reflected the democratic ideals of the New Deal, but also helped to foster a sense of national identity and cultural purpose during a time of great uncertainty and change. As the summer of 1933 gave way to fall, the FTP continued to expand its reach and scope, with new productions and initiatives springing up in cities across the country. The project's impact was being felt not only in the world of arts and culture, but also in the broader economy, as it provided jobs and stimulus for local communities. In October 1933, the FTP launched a major new initiative, the Living Newspaper Series, which used theater to explore current events and social issues. The first production in the series, AAA, Plowed Under, examined the impact of the Depression on American agriculture, while subsequent productions tackled topics such as labor rights, housing, and public health. The Living Newspaper Series was a major success, attracting large audiences and critical acclaim for its innovative approach to storytelling and social commentary. The series also helped to establish the FTP as a major force in American cultural life, one that was committed to exploring the complexities and challenges of modern America through the power of art and imagination. As the fall of 1933 wore on, the FTP continued to push the boundaries of what was possible in American theater, using its productions to explore new themes, styles, and technologies. The project's emphasis on experimentation and innovation helped to foster a sense of creativity and possibility, even in the darkest days of the Depression. As the fall of 1933 wore on, the FTP's Living Newspaper Series continued to gain momentum, with productions like Power and One-Third of a Nation exploring the complexities of American life during the Depression. The series' innovative approach to storytelling, which combined drama, music, and visual arts to explore current events and social issues, resonated deeply with audiences across the country. In New York City, for example, the FTP's production of Power at the Biltmore Theater drew large crowds and critical acclaim, with many praising its thought-provoking portrayal of the struggles faced by American workers in the utilities industry. One of the key figures behind the success of the Living Newspaper series was Hallie Flanagan, the FTP's national director. A pioneering theater artist and educator, Flanagan had been instrumental in shaping the project's vision and direction from its earliest days. Under her leadership, the FTP had established a network of regional offices and production units across the country, each of which was tasked with developing new works that reflected the unique experiences and concerns of their local communities. This approach not only helped to foster a sense of national unity and shared purpose, but also allowed the FTP to tap into the creative energies of artists and writers from diverse backgrounds and regions. In November 1933, Flanagan traveled to Chicago to oversee the production of a new living newspaper play, Injunction Granted, which explored the struggles of American labor unions during the Depression. The play was written by a team of local writers and researchers who drew on real-life events and experiences to create a powerful and thought-provoking drama. With its innovative use of documentary-style narration, music, and visual effects, Injunction Granted helped to establish the FTP as a major force in American theater, one that was committed to exploring the complexities and challenges of modern life through the power of art and imagination. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the FTP's national office was working closely with government agencies and community organizations to develop new programs and initiatives that would help to promote economic recovery and social reform. One notable example was the FTP's collaboration with the Civilian Conservation Corps, a New Deal program that provided jobs and training for young men in conservation and infrastructure development. The FTP worked with CCC officials to develop a series of plays and pageants that would help to promote the program's goals and values, while also providing entertainment and education for the thousands of young men enrolled in the program. As the winter of 1933-34 wore on, the FTP's collaboration with the Civilian Conservation Corps continued to bear fruit. With a series of plays and pageants that helped to promote the program's goals and values, while providing entertainment and education for the thousands of young men enrolled in the program. One notable example was a play called Conservation, which was written by a team of FTP writers and performed by a troupe of CCC enrollees at camps across the country. For example, the project worked closely with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FDR, to develop a series of plays and pageants that would help to raise awareness about the needs of families affected by the Depression. One notable example was a play called The Forgotten Man, which was written by a team of FTP writers and performed at relief centers and community organizations across the country. In February 1934, the FTP launched a new initiative aimed at promoting the work of American playwrights and providing opportunities for emerging writers. The project, called the Playwrights Project, provided funding and support for a series of new plays that explored themes related to the Depression and the New Deal. One notable example was a play called Waiting for Lefty, which was written by Clifford Odets and performed at the FTP's theater in New York City. In Chicago, for example, the FTP's production unit developed a series of plays and pageants that explored the experiences of African American communities in the city. One notable example was a play called The Negro Speaks, which was written by a team of local writers and performed at the FTP's theater on the city's south side. In April 1934, the FTP's national director, Hallie Flanagan, traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional committee about the project's work and its impact on American communities. Flanagan highlighted the FTP's success in promoting economic recovery and social reform and argued that the project was an essential part of the New Deal's efforts to revitalize American culture and society. She also emphasized the importance of continued funding for the project, which was facing budget cuts and other challenges as the federal government sought to reduce its spending. Despite these challenges, the FTP continued to thrive in the spring and summer of 1934. With new productions and initiatives springing up in cities across the country. In Los Angeles, for example, The FTP's production unit developed a series of plays and pageants that explored the experiences of Mexican-American communities in the Southwest. One notable example was a play called The Strike, which was written by a team of local writers and performed at the FTP's theater in the city. One notable example was a composition called The River, which was written by a young composer named Virgil Thompson and performed at the FTP's theater in New York City. In August 1934, the FTP's national director, Hallie Flanagan, traveled to the West Coast to oversee the project's work in California and other states. Flanagan was impressed by the quality and diversity of the production she saw, and argued that the FTP was making a major contribution to American culture and society. One notable example was a play called The Factory, which was written by a team of local writers and performed at the FTP's theater in the city. As the fall of 1934 progressed, the FTP continued to produce plays and pageants that reflected the concerns and struggles of American workers. In Chicago, the FTP's production unit developed a series of plays that explored the experiences of industrial workers in the city's meatpacking plants. In New York City, the FTP's production unit developed a series of plays that explored the experiences of African-American communities in Harlem. One notable example was a play called The Negro Speaks, which was written by a young playwright named Langston Hughes and performed at the FTP's theater in the city. In October 1934, the FTP's national director, Hallie Flanagan, traveled to the South to oversee the project's work in states such as Alabama and Georgia. In January 1935, the FTP's national director, Hallie Flanagan, testified before a congressional committee about the project's work and its impact on American communities. In Seattle, the FTP's production unit developed a series of plays that explored the experiences of Asian American communities in the Pacific Northwest. One notable example was a play called The New Pioneer, which was written by a team of local writers and performed at the FTP's theater in the city. As the winter of 1935 progressed, the FTP's production unit in Chicago continued to thrive, with plays like The Steelworker sparking important discussions about labor rights and worker safety. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt was preparing to launch a new series of programs and policies aimed at stimulating economic recovery and providing relief to those still struggling. In April 1935, Roosevelt signed the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act, which allocated $4.8 billion for various New Deal programs, including the Works Progress Administration, the Federal Theater Project's parent organization. The WPA's new funding enabled the FTP to expand its operations, with new production units opening in cities like San Francisco and Boston. In May 1935, the FTP launched a new series of plays focused on the experiences of migrant workers, including Tobacco Road, which premiered in New York City and went on to become one of the project's most popular productions. As the summer of 1935 approached, the FTP was producing over 200 plays per week, with audiences totaling over 25 million people nationwide. Despite its successes, the FTP faced increasing criticism from conservative lawmakers who saw the project as a hotbed of radicalism and communist activity. In June 1935, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, launched an investigation into alleged communist infiltration of the FTP, leading to a series of high-profile hearings and testimony from prominent artists and intellectuals. The HUAC investigation ultimately led to the blacklisting of several FTP writers and directors, including the project's national director, Hallie Flanagan. In August 1935, Flanagan was called to testify before HUAC, where she faced intense questioning about her alleged ties to communist organizations. Despite the controversy surrounding her, Flanagan remained a vocal advocate for the importance of arts funding and the need for government support of creative expression. As the summer drew to a close, the FTP continued to produce plays and other performances, including a series of experimental radio broadcasts that explored new forms of storytelling and audio drama. In the fall of 1935, the FTP launched a new initiative focused on documenting and preserving American folk culture, with teams of researchers and ethnographers traveling across the country to collect stories, songs, and other forms of traditional expression. This project, known as the Federal Theater Project's Folk Culture Program, resulted in the creation of over 1,000 interviews, recordings, and other documents that remain an invaluable resource for scholars and artists today. As 1935 drew to a close, the FTP was facing significant challenges, including declining funding and increasing pressure from conservative lawmakers. Despite these obstacles, the project continued to produce innovative and provocative works, including a series of plays focused on issues like racism, poverty, and labor rights. The production was a major success, with audiences praising its powerful storytelling and innovative staging. However, the play's explicit portrayal of class conflict and labor activism sparked controversy, with some critics accusing the FTP of promoting communist propaganda. As the curtain fell on The Cradle Will Rock, the FTP was facing an uncertain future, with funding cuts and political pressure threatening to silence the project's powerful voice forever. In June 1939, after years of struggling to maintain funding and support, the Federal Theater Project was officially shut down by Congress, marking the end of a groundbreaking experiment in government-funded arts programming. The project's legacy, however, continued to be felt, with many of its alumni going on to become major figures in American theater, film, and literature. As the United States entered a new decade, the FTP's innovative spirit and commitment to social justice would continue to inspire artists and activists, shaping the course of American cultural history for generations to come. The end of the Federal Theater Project coincided with the onset of World War II, which brought significant changes to the American economy and society. As the war effort mobilized, many of the economic problems that had plagued the country during the Great Depression began to recede, replaced by new challenges and opportunities. The United States' entry into the war marked a major turning point in the country's history, as it emerged from a decade of crisis and transformation to take on a new role as a global superpower. In the years following the war, the United States experienced a period of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity, often referred to as the post-war boom. This era saw significant advances in technology, infrastructure, and consumer culture, as well as major changes in American society and politics. The legacy of the Great Depression and the New Deal continued to shape American policy and culture, with many of the programs and institutions established during the 1930s remaining in place today. As the post-war era progressed, the United States faced new challenges and opportunities, from the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement to the rise of suburbanization and consumer culture. Through it all, the country continued to grapple with the lessons of the Great Depression, seeking to balance economic growth and social justice in a rapidly changing world. The Federal Theater Project, with its bold experimentation and commitment to social justice, stands as a powerful testament to the human spirit's capacity for creativity and resilience in the face of adversity. The Great Depression may be behind us, but its impact remains, a poignant reminder of the enduring power of human ingenuity and the importance of empathy, compassion, and collective action in overcoming even the most daunting challenges. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.